So welcome back, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you again, and I'm really looking forward to our the second plenary address. Have a lot to cover, and I just to give you fair warning, I'm going to put on my professor hat on. And we're going to get a little nerdy. We're going to go through some research, and it's going to feel a little bit different than this morning's address. And what I want to do this afternoon is to kind of paint a picture and portray what an example of a holistic kind of Christian perspective on mental health might be, and to do so through the lens of trauma and PTSD. And what I want to do to start off with is to start off with the definition of trauma. So what the heck is trauma? So according to the DSM-5, which is kind of like the Bible of psychologists and mental health professionals, a traumatic event is characterized by the following. When a person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or to others. And in older versions of definitions of trauma, they also included the second component, which reads, a person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, and horror. And they've actually taken that out. So you don't actually necessarily have to have that criteria in place for something to qualify as a traumatic event. And the reason why we took that out is because we find that people respond and react to traumatic experiences differently. Like some people will endorse that fear and helplessness and horror, and you can see that. But other people don't, at least not initially. They'll develop symptoms a little bit later on, but it's just as traumatic for those individuals. So they took that out. So what are some potential examples of traumas? You have motor vehicle accidents, something that many of us can relate to. You have natural disasters, stuff like earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, lightning, thunder and lightning, or severe thunder and lightning. You have sexual assault and sexual trauma. And I don't have time to get into this too much, but I have done some research and some work on clergy sexual misconduct. And I just want to give you a few highlights from the research in case if this is something that might be interesting to you. To date, the largest scale study on clergy sexual misconduct was conducted by Baylor University in 2008, and they defined clergy sexual abuse as the following. When ministers, priests, rabbis, or other clergy persons or religious leaders who make sexual advances or propositions to persons in their congregations they serve who are not their spouses or significant others. Here's some statistics about clergy sexual misconduct. In this Baylor study, they found that more than 3% of women who attended a congregation in the last month reported that they have experienced CSM at some time in their adult lives. Research suggests that 92% of these advances are made in secret. 67% of the offenders are married at the time of the advance. And they also find that only a small minority of survivors of sexual misconduct end up reporting it to religious authorities, and even fewer percentage end up reporting it to civil authorities, right? Even though things like this really are within the realm of such kind of reporting. And only 8% reported having known of CSM in a congregation they attended. Some other studies have found that, one study found that up to 10 to 14% of pastors have had some form of sexual contact with someone other than a spouse in their ministry. From other studies, they found figures that are closer to either 19% or 12%. And one startling statistic initially when I read this found that before a clergy member who engages in these kinds of acts, before this finally comes to light, an average number of 7 women are usually already involved in it by the time someone shares and comes forth and addresses the problem. And as we all know, the Me Too movement is alive and well here in America, and it's beginning to spread within our evangelical churches. And I believe that we're really just on the cusp of kind of a reckoning, a day of reckoning, where a lot of the churches, at least from the evangelical Protestant tradition, needs to confront. This is kind of an ugly reality that we confront. I was just teaching on trauma and spiritual formation in Taiwan last month, and I got ushered into a meeting with a newly formed ethics committee to handle cases of clergy sexual misconduct. And they find that, at least in Taiwan, that approximately 1 in 7 congregations have this kind of thing happening there. And I suspect that the prevalence rate is probably pretty similar here in America as well. Other forms of trauma, you have childhood trauma, and I want to speak a little bit about childhood trauma as well. As I insinuated earlier, childhood trauma is a lot more prevalent than we initially think. With one study finding that up to 60% of children and adolescents in the United States, this isn't kind of an international study, this is here a national sample in the United States, reported some sort of violence exposure in the past year. 10% reporting child maltreatment, which includes physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. 6.1% reported sexual victimization. And there's also kind of various risk factors depending if you're a boy or a girl, or if you grew up in a rural setting and an urban setting. And one of the some of the research that I find very alarming is that studies have sought to kind of quantify or to assess and investigate, like, how do church members define, how do they define abuse? And do church members and Christians define abuse in a way that's similar or different than the general population? And one study that comes to mind, and this was replicated by one of my doctoral students when she wrote her dissertation on this subject, has found that, and what they did in this study is they took, they put together real life examples of abuse cases, and they kind of mixed them up with kind of non-abuse cases, and they've invited a group of non-Christians and a group of Christian pastors to rate each situation as, well, is this abuse or not? And, rate on a scale of 1 to 10, would you report it? And they found that a statistically significant trend of Christians under-reporting abuse. And it requires a stronger, higher threshold of abuse before Christians will generally endorse or identify or label something as abuse. And I think this research such as this just kind of illuminates how important conferences such as this are, how important the work of organizations such as NAMI is, because we really need to get the word out and do more education, this kind of education within our religious communities. So one study, called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, they sought to look at the impact of childhood abuse and a childhood trauma, and they tried to look at, well, how does childhood trauma impact a person over the course of their entire life for the rest of their lives? And how they defined childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences. It included things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, growing up in households with alcoholics, with mentally ill, with separation, divorce, so on and so forth. And what they found is encapsulated by this kind of pyramid structure where, at the bottom of this pyramid, you get this sense, you have these adverse childhood experiences, these traumatic experiences, and they kind of, unfortunately, they will tend to form kind of a foundation for the kind of life that this individual will live for the rest of their life. And they find that these early childhood traumas oftentimes can lead to disrupted brain development, and that this disrupted brain development actually makes it more difficult for people when they get older, for these children when they get older, to develop healthy relationships, to be able to cope with their emotions in a more healthy way, right? And that these in turn, these social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, they lead to poor decisions, and they lead to high-risk behaviors such as substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, as well as self-harm, and that these high-risk behaviors in turn later in life contribute to chronic physical health conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, chronic illness, and all of this kind of culminates into these statistically observable, empirically observable trends that people who survive childhood trauma, they end up dying earlier in life, right? So one study has concluded, and if you want to read those statistics, you're welcome to download the PowerPoint slides that will be available later after this conference. But another set of researchers, in view of all the research results on childhood trauma and its impact on the rest of one's life, they concluded that adverse childhood experiences are a major health issue and result in social, cognitive, and emotional impairment that oftentimes you can feel the consequences for the rest of their lives, and you can often link them to a higher risk for various forms of chronic kind of physiological, medical conditions. So again, this is just adding some data to this theme that we talked about earlier this morning, which is, a lot of times the effect of tragedy and the effect of sin, if I can call it that, they don't just disappear. They persist, but they might look different, but they're still there, and they're still very much felt. What are some other examples of trauma? You have combat trauma, we have domestic violence, and we have several other forms of trauma as well. It's just that a lot of times we don't know to call it such. So I have a question for you all to discuss with the person next to you. How common is trauma in your community or in your church? And if trauma occurred, how likely would it be for people to talk about it at church? And if they do talk about it at church, what resources might be available for them? What I want to do is pivot a little bit and not talk about not just trauma, but a specific mental health condition called post-traumatic stress disorder that can develop after someone has survived a trauma. So what I want to do is start off by talking about the symptom clusters of PTSD. So the first requirement to be diagnosed with PTSD, of course, is that you've experienced and survived some form of trauma. The second kind of symptom cluster of PTSD is what we call re-experiencing symptoms, right? So what am I talking about re-experiencing? I'm talking about nightmares. A lot of times people who've been traumatized will relive their traumatic event in their dreams. Right? So a lot of times the first place I will look when I work with trauma survivors is how are their sleeping habits? Because I don't know anyone who has struggled with trauma who sleeps very regularly and very well. And one of the reasons why people have problems with sleep is because they don't want to sleep, because they don't want to have these recurring nightmares. And they don't have control over what comes up in their dreams, right? You also have flashbacks, which is kind of a form of, kind of like a nightmare, but you're awake. So you're awake, but then when you're in a flashback, it's as if you're reliving that moment, right? You also have intrusive memories. So a lot of times people will just be minding their own business, and then all of a sudden something in the environment cues them, or something in the environment just reminds them or takes them back to the trauma. It could be something as simple as maybe smelling a certain kind of cologne that reminds you of the person who did something to you. Or it might even be like an anniversary date, where it just reminds you of something that happened that was very difficult in the past. And then out of nowhere, the memories of what happened just kind of flood in, right? And they feel like they're intrusive, like someone's just kind of forcing them into your mind, despite all your efforts to kind of block them out. Another symptom cluster of PTSD are what we call negative thoughts and emotions. And here we're talking about stuff like depressed mood. So it's possible to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder at the same time as PTSD. In fact, people with PTSD usually are diagnosed with something else as well. It's more common for PTSD to coexist with some other mental health diagnosis than it is for PTSD to just exist on its own. So you have depressed mood, you have problems with concentration. So a lot of times in our elementary schools, we'll have kids who can't concentrate, or they'll begin acting out. And usually when we see kids like that, we think like, okay, maybe they have ADHD. A lot of times it's because they have trauma, right? And we're medicating people for the wrong wrong condition, right? They're acting out because something happened to them and they don't know how to cope with it, and they're just acting out on it. And what happens is we end up punishing them for it. And we kind of send this message of like, you shouldn't act out on this. And it's true that you shouldn't act out in certain ways that are unhealthy, but we also tell them to avoid. And we'll talk more about avoidance in just a bit. The fourth symptom cluster of PTSD is what we call hyperarousal, and these are kind of related to the panic/anxiety kind of symptoms. And a psychological term that I find very helpful is this term called hypervigilance, right? And hypervigilance is just this idea of I'm constantly on the lookout for threats, right? So a lot of times you can tell if someone survived trauma just by looking at their eyes. So when someone walks into the room, oftentimes what they will do is they will position themselves like this, right, with their backs to the wall. And that's because they don't have to worry about what's behind them. They don't need to assess for threats behind them. And not only do they sit here with their backs on the wall, but they're also right next to an entrance. So when you look at the eyes of a trauma survivor, oftentimes, not only is it moving everywhere to assess for potential threats, but it's also noticing where the entry points and the exit points are. So when you walk into a room, the first place the eyes will go is where can threats come in and where can I get out? And usually, these three symptom clusters, they're part of natural human experience. It's human to experience these symptoms after a trauma, right? For those of you who've gone through a bad car accident, I'm sure that many of you can relate to this idea of like, well, maybe for a period of time, like a week or two, following the car accident, you just don't really want to drive. You're a little scared. You're kind of constantly checking for people running red lights, and guess what? That's just that's these symptoms. That's normal human life, right? A normal human reaction. But research, one of the most robust findings on research from research on PTSD and trauma, is that the number one predictor of differentiator between people who go on to develop PTSD and people who go on to just recover eventually is this last symptom cluster, avoidance. Right? Because when we get into a car accident, we're afraid of driving, we don't want to drive, we're super hypervigilant, but guess what? We still have to go to school, we still have to go to work, so we kind of suck it up and we go ahead and drive. It's not fun for the first few weeks, but eventually our body gets reprogrammed to realize that, okay, maybe I did have a car accident, but driving inherently isn't that dangerous, even though my body feels that way, right? But for people who engage in avoidance, like I don't want to think about it, I don't want to go to anything that reminds me of it, guess what? These three symptom clusters will go on to develop a life of their own. And when they do that, that's called PTSD. So I have a second assignment for you to discuss. What are examples of avoidant behavior? Because there's a lot. You can avoid people, you can avoid thoughts, you can avoid places, and you can engage in all certain sorts of behaviors to avoid things. What are some examples of that? Go ahead. Interesting thing about workaholism is at the Veterans Hospital, in the last decade, they've experienced a sudden influx of PTSD veterans with PTSD who fought in the Vietnam War, right? Why is that the case? It's actually related to workaholism. That these veterans actually had PTSD for the last 30, 40 years. It's just that they drowned themselves in work. And lo and behold, once they approach retirement age, they can't avoid anymore, and all the symptoms come up, and it feels as if like, now I have PTSD, when all along you've had PTSD for the last 30, 40 years. You were just avoiding through work. There's substance abuse, self-harm behaviors, avoiding places, binging, eating, emotional numbness, and there's a lot to talk about that, but I don't have time to. Social withdrawal, and something you'll often find among the younger generation is kind of binge gaming. Right? So video games could potentially be a form of avoidance, of avoiding reality, as well as binge watching like Netflix kind of thing, right? And of course, there's nothing wrong with playing video games, nothing wrong with watching a little Netflix and stuff, but it can get to a place where it's unhealthy when it's so much, you can tell that they're doing it as a crutch to avoid something that that's happening in their life. So as I mentioned earlier, not everyone who experiences a trauma goes on to develop PTSD, but one of the strongest predictors of those who do and don't is this theme of avoidance. And I also want to add to this list, there are actually a lot of spiritualized forms of avoidance as well. There's a lot of advice that you can give that sound really Christian and sound really spiritual, but when you get down to it, it's actually just all about avoidance. Right? Have you encountered individuals? I've worked with individuals who have survived trauma, and understandably, they're just going through all this gunk. All this gunk is coming out of their heart, because something horrible happened to them. And then you have Christians tell them, well, they quote scripture like, whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is, think of those things. That's true. That's still the word of God, but you're just telling to avoid. Don't think about that. Just think about the good stuff. Just think about what's good and true and lovely, right? But the problem is that what happened to him was not lovely, and they also need to think about that as well, right? So I'll talk about this a little bit more later today, but we need to expand our Christian spirituality to incorporate both the good and the positive, as well as the bad and the evil. So what are some other risk factors that might increase the likelihood of someone going on to develop PTSD? Research has identified a number of these other risk factors, which include gender, age, socioeconomic status, family dysfunction, your natural coping style, history of traumatic exposures, also your biology, your genetic disposition, as well as your potential dysfunctional nervous system. And what I think about when I think about those topics is that, you can just tell that some people are born, and I call this a gift, with this gift of feeling deeply. They're deep feelers. And a lot of times you can tell that they're this way even when they're children, right? And that's a gift, and it can also be a curse, depending on how you wield that gift and if you have to survive trauma. There's also other risk factors for PTSD that have to do with the traumatic event itself. That is, if it involves something that was life-threatening, if you witnessed grotesque deaths, if it involves someone that you knew, like either you lost someone that you knew or someone that you knew did something to you, that is a risk factor. If what happened was unpredictable and uncontrollable, and if something happened that was sexual in nature. And the research again suggests that there's something about the combination of sexual and childhood, when you put those two together, there's something about childhood sexual trauma that it just represents kind of it's one of the worst forms of trauma and one of the most complicated to recover as well. And of all the potential risk factors for PTSD, what I want to do is spend most of the rest of our time together just honing in and focusing on one potential risk factor, because this risk factor actually is something that we can control, and it's also a risk factor that we all have an important role in. And this risk factor is the role of social support. Social support is one of the most powerful determinants of whether or not someone is going to recover from trauma. And by social support, we're not talking about like professional psychologists such as myself, but we're talking about friends, families, pastors, people in their natural support network, people in their church communities, right? So it can be formal or informal, but I'll talk about that distinction a little bit later. And one of the findings of research is that depending on the nature of the social support you receive, that social support actually predicts PTSD even more powerfully than the severity of the traumatic event itself. Like how people in your primary social support network react and respond to you after it happened, that predicts PTSD more robustly than the severity of the trauma itself. So the lack of social support, and especially the presence of negative social support, is one of the strongest predictors of PTSD and is a strong impediment to recovery. And here's that research article I was referring to, that a lack of social support more strongly predicted PTSD than other factors such as prior trauma history, prior mental illness, or even the severity of the trauma itself. All right. So what we do as a community matters, and that's what the research says unequivocally. So let's define what social support is. Social support is those social interactions or relationships that provide actual assistance or a feeling of attachment to a group that is perceived as caring and loving. One distinction that I want to point out and highlight is that social support can be positive, makes us feel loved, but it can also be negative. Even though the intention wasn't negative, the way it's received can be negative, and unfortunately, that's really all that is required for it to be negative social support. What are some examples of negative social support? You have reactions that are intended or perceived as critical, blaming, or grossly insensitive. So for example, following a sexual assault, and I've seen this happen in real life, it's actually very common. At least he didn't use a weapon, you're lucky. It's over, try to put it behind you. Or even worse yet, what were you doing? Why were you not more careful? Right? And then you have, some of the stuff we talked about earlier this morning. God's ways are higher than our ways. Whatever is true, whatever is pure, think of those things. Don't think about all these negative things that came from your trauma. Think about all these positive things. There's also indifference. And there's also just messages that full on just encourage avoidance. And research finds that if you have a person with both positive and negative support at the same time, unfortunately, the negative speaks stronger. It kind of supersedes the positive, right? What are some common forms of negative reactions? You have reactions that blame the individual to suggest that they're in some form or shape responsible for what happened. You have feedback that casts doubt on, well, maybe it didn't really happen. Are you sure it happened that way? Or maybe it would, maybe is it as traumatic, is this as bad as you say it was, right? You have criticism, like stop talking about it, and you have invalidation, like why don't you look on the bright side? And let me spend a little extra time on the invalidation. Invalidation and indifference, and how this usually plays out in real life is a lack of response. So you have something that was crazy that just happened, and everyone's quiet. And everyone just goes on their merry day, and it's just life is normal. And that is really confusing, because what just happened was crazy, and it's going to change my life forever. But everyone around me is just acting as if it was it's just life is normal, right? And here's some reasons why invalidation and indifference is so potentially destructive. First of all, it suppresses our natural coping responses. So one of the things I tell my clients a lot of times is that you have to acknowledge what happened before you can cope. You have to acknowledge and accept that you have an emotion before you can start coping with that emotion. And what invalidation says is like, well, you shouldn't feel the way you feel. You feel really angry right now, you feel really, really depressed, but you really shouldn't feel that way, right? So it kind of knocks you down before you even have a chance to recover. Because in reality, you really need to cope with your anger and your depression or whatever emotions come up. But when you're invalidated when these emotions are invalidated, you don't even have a chance to accept that these emotions are even there. And you don't even have a chance, therefore, to cope with them or to do something about it. It leads people to stop reaching out, to isolate themselves. I should be able to move on. And it also enhances negative self-appraisals of what happened, like, it was my fault. Everything I touch always ends up horrible like this. But research also suggests that removing negative social support alone is not adequate. We also need positive forms of social support, and that when we provide positive social support, it really enhances one's capability to recover well and to recover quickly. And there's different kinds of positive social support. There's a distinction between emotional support, which is support that's aimed at meeting emotional needs. And there's also positive social support in the form of instrumental support, which is support aimed at meeting practical needs. And if I have to choose between the two, I would say that churches, by and large, are great at the instrumental support. They'll bring food, they'll provide childcare and stuff, but we might need a little growth on the emotional support. And the reason why this is important is because research suggests that it's actually the emotional support that's more facilitative of recovery than the instrumental support. So we don't need to stop doing the instrumental support, but we need to recognize it's the emotional support that really is the most helpful for one's recovery process. There's also a differentiation between formal social support and informal social support. So formal social supports would come from psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health, professionals and the like. And informal support comes from family, friends, church communities, pastors, and the like. And while, again, there's a time and place for both, research suggests that it's actually the informal support that is actually potentially more conducive and more powerfully predicts recovery, right? Which, again, speaks to the importance of conferences and work like this, because if we can mobilize churches to be what some people call trauma-informed, or if we can have trauma-informed churches, if we can have mental health-informed churches that know how to care for people who are depressed and anxious, the capacity for good is so much more than what a person like myself can do. So as a summary, I want to again highlight informal social support, and I want to highlight emotional support, and also want to highlight the potential impact of negative social support. And that's kind of the three main takeaways of my quick 5-minute literature review on a lot of research on trauma and recovery. So let's talk a little bit more about, what does trauma therapy actually look like, in the counseling room? This is generally what it looks like. These are the beliefs. Sometimes these beliefs are stated, sometimes they're understood, but either way, they're felt. That by and large, many, and I would even dare to say most, trauma survivors probably believe one or more or all of these beliefs. That I am responsible for the abuse or trauma. It's my fault. It's wrong for me to show anger, frustration, defiance, discouragement, or critical attitude. I can't handle the memories of what happened, so therefore I need to avoid more. I must be punished, and I can't trust myself or others. So the question I want to throw back to you guys is this. Where do these beliefs come from? Because it feels like almost everyone who survived trauma can relate to some of these or all of these. They don't come out of nowhere. They come from somewhere, and there's probably a lot of sources where these draw from. What are some that you can think of? Go ahead. So let's come back together. And again, I feel like we can probably spend at least half an hour talking about this. And I really would have wished that we had some space for me to hear more about what you guys are hearing, because the little that was shared last in the morning was just fantastic. But let me talk a little bit about one potential source where some of these ideas come from. It's not the only one, but I think it's a particularly important one, and one that's particularly common among religious communities or faith communities, and one that unfortunately is also linked to mental health stigma. And it is what we call the just world hypothesis. And the just world hypothesis is simply this: good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. Right? And if we had time, I would have loved to invite you to discuss questions like, well, why do people in faith often endorse the just world hypothesis? And I think part of the answer is, you don't need to go very far, just go to Sunday school. And the moral of every story is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, and therefore we need to do good things, so therefore good things will happen, right? But guess what? People take those, that might be appropriate for kids, but I think it still needs to be more nuanced for kids. But if you believe that as a kid, oftentimes you'll still believe that as an adult. And when something traumatic happens to you and you're trying to fit and make sense of, find meaning of what happened, other people will fit your experience through that, and you'll fit your own experience through that. Well, this horrible thing happened to me. I must be a bad person. I must have done something wrong. Right. And it's tragic because a lot of times people feel like this is Christianity, but this is totally not Christianity, guys. Jesus died on the cross. Was it because he did something bad? This is pretty much the opposite of the just world hypothesis, right? And yet this is so prevalent among so many of our religious communities. And this really is a source where we get into trouble. Right? Because when we hold on to a just world, we will see and interpret our experiences through the lens of a just world. And inevitably, it will take us farther and farther away from being present to the real realities of people who are going through, and more into some form of spiritualized avoidance. Right? Presence is the opposite of avoidance. And I would even add that authentic Christian spirituality, it never avoids. It always engages reality, because we are just following in Christ's footsteps, who became incarnate and came into this world, and he knows exactly how broken this world is. Forgive me for going a little overtime, but I do want to leave you with a few more thoughts. So I think an important part of what it means to take on a holistic Christian perspective on mental illness, it also includes us being honest and critically re-examining how our understanding of the gospel, how our understanding of the Christian faith might fall short of what it was intended to be. And what the gospel is intended to be is a message of hope and redemption to a fallen world, right? And the first consideration that I wanted to bring up, the question of, well, what are Christians to do? This is a question I posed in this morning. What can Christians do when there's brokenness that just persists and doesn't go away no matter how hard we try? I think the first place we go is to 50% of the Bible that we don't usually hear on Sundays, on lament, right? That's part of our Christian spirituality as well, and that needs to be part of our care of souls who struggle with mental illness. Glenn Pemberton, he actually did a study, and he found about modern contemporary worship music, and he found that when he looked at the Psalms of the Bible, all 150 of them, he found that 40% of the Psalms in the Bible are actually Psalms of lament, right? The ones that are kind of uncomfortable, where King David is really angry and really sad, and he kind of goes through this emotional role. Those ones that we kind of don't really preach on too much, right? And yet, when it comes to the top 100 praise and worship songs that evangelical churches sing, less than 5 out of the top 100 would qualify as lament. And I don't think, unfortunately, and this is kind of to our shame, there's not much in our spirituality, at least in its contemporary evangelical form. We don't have much to say for those of us whose lives do not fit that narrative of victory and redemption, right? And what I've seen tragically is that so many people who are trying their best to follow God, and their lives just don't conform into that narrative, they go away, especially from Easter service, where we celebrate God's victory and resurrection. They go away discouraged because they feel like maybe my story doesn't belong in the Christian narrative, because I'm not victorious right now. I'm still suffering through the consequences of what happened to me in the past. And there's this wonderful book called Spirit and Trauma by Shelley Rambo. And what she talks about is that there's Good Friday, and that's when Jesus died and was crucified and is horrible. It's a trauma, by the way. Our whole faith is built on the trauma of Christ dying on the cross, right? And then there's Easter Sunday, where Christ conquered death, resurrected from the dead, and rose to heaven. And what a lot of times our churches will do is that we want to skip Good Friday and go straight to the Easter Sunday and go straight to the victory and then the redemption. But the problem is that Christ hasn't returned yet. So the world's still broken. And this work on the cross, it's not fully consummated yet. And for those of us who have survived trauma, and for those of us who lived a life that doesn't conform to this victory narrative, what Rambo describes us is that we are living in a perpetual Holy Saturday. Right? We're stuck in between. We know Jesus died and he resurrected, but he hasn't returned yet. I've seen glimpses of God and his deliverance, but it's not complete because I'm still living with the brokenness that persists. And I have a real hope that one day that brokenness will be healed, but that day's not now. Right? So reclaiming the role of lament in Christian spirituality. And the second thing that I want to share, and sorry for going late, just 2 more minutes, is what I call the starting point of the gospel. When I was younger and I used to share my faith with other people, my starting point is that the world is orderly and good and just, right? God loves you and has a wonderful plan in your life, for your life. And if you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you get to join in this world that is orderly and good and fair and just, right? So a lot of times when I hear people preach, they preach out of this assumption that the world is good and fair and just, and we just need to enter into it, right? I don't know if it's because I've gotten a lot more cynical or I'm just getting old, but now when I share the gospel, I'm at the complete opposite. And I start off with, you know what? The world's a crazy mess. And God actually knows. He chose to come down here. He saw it in full, and he suffered the most horrific death in the world you can imagine, so he can have a relationship with you. And if you take his hand, so to speak, he'll accompany you through all that mess, because we worship a God who knows exactly what it's like to live here. So reimagining the gospel to be trauma-informed, mental health-informed, it's not just for the benefit of those of us who have mental illness, it's also the benefit for us to have a more robust gospel that's actually truer to its original intent. Thank you very much.